Nothing like watching little feet pattering down the aisle to do an errand. Our scripture reading is from 1 Kings 21, and the immediate context of this is where God told Elijah to go meet Ahab in the garden or the plot of ground of Naboth, who Jezebel had Naboth and his whole family murdered so that Ahab could take possession of it. So Elijah does what God asks him to do. He's walking right into a dangerous zone because Ahab has been hunting for him. And Ahab comes around the corner of a vineyard or of a vine or something, and there's Elijah. And this is what happens. And Ahab said to Elijah, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" And he answered, "I have found you, because you have sold yourself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring evil upon you, and will take away your posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that relieves himself against the wall, and he that is shut up and left in Israel, and will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith you have provoked me to anger and made Israel to sin." Both of those kings, and Ahab knew the history well, their families had been completely wiped out when the next king took over. And of Jezebel also the Lord spoke, saying, "The dogs will eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." Sounds impossible. "He that dies of Ahab in the city, the dogs will eat. He that dies in the field, the fowls of the air will eat. But there was none that sold himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord like Ahab, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably in following idols, exactly as had the Amorites, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. And it came to pass, when Ahab heard these words, he rent his clothes, put on sackcloth on his flesh, and fasted, and lay in sackcloth, and went softly. And the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, "Do you see how Ahab humbles himself before me? Because he humbles himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house."
What's the first thing that comes to mind when someone says the word Hitler?
Fascism.
Evil. You kind of recoil a little. Or maybe the word Adolf, Hitler's first name. Even though it's been years, 60, 70 years, just the mention of the man's name brings images to mind, right? You've seen pictures of atrocities he was behind. And how about, you just heard David read a little about Ahab. Don't you have somewhat the same kind of feeling when you hear about Ahab? It's only bad news, right? The man did things that weren't so nice. But I get to thinking about Ahab, and I think we might have more in common with Ahab than it's pleasant to think about. Or we might be able to learn something from Ahab. Ahab figures prominently in the story of ancient Israel, the northern kingdom. a lot of the description of the history is devoted to Ahab. Let me tell you a little bit about how Ahab got his start. The two kingdoms divided after Solomon was king. We had Rehoboam in the south, and we had Jeroboam in the north. And it wasn't too much later, too many years or too many kings later, that Ahab comes along. In fact, in Judah, the southern kingdom, we had Rehoboam, and after that we had his son Abijah for 3 years. And then King Asa, who ruled for a long time, 42 or 44 years. In the northern kingdom, things weren't so stable. After Jeroboam ruled, his son Nadab ruled for 2 years, and then Baasha killed everybody, any descendant of Jeroboam's, and took the kingdom. And he reigned for a while, but then his son reigned for 2 years, and one of the chariot commanders murdered all of Baasha's descendants and became the king. It wasn't too long-lived, though, because as soon as he murdered Baasha, the general of the army, the commander of the army, Omri, was crowned king by the army. Meanwhile, Zimri, who had killed the king, declared himself the king, but Omri decided that that wasn't to be, and so even though they were fighting with the Philistines, he took the army, let the Philistines be, and he went and laid siege to the capital. And it's kind of an awful story. The end of Zimri, he realized he was defeated, that the army was surrounding the city, and he had no one to defend him. So he ran into the palace and lit it on fire, and that was the end of him and everything to do with him. But then there was another guy, Tibni, that a lot of the people in Israel wanted to be king. And there was a civil war of sorts, and Omri wins the civil war, and he rules for 12 years. It's not an orderly succession, and I think it's important to note that God didn't necessarily put Omri into the kingship. He just took it with some machinations. Took it by force, being in the commander of the army. Ahab was Omri's son. So Ahab sees all of this turmoil, and there's no respect for God. It's just a matter of who can wield the more powerful force that becomes king. That person becomes king, and in this case, Ahab's dad becomes king. And when Ahab dies, when Omri dies, Ahab becomes the king. Now, Omri also was kind of a real estate magnate. He bought a hill from a fellow named Shemer and named it Samaria. And you've heard of Samaria. But it started out as a city. He built a city there, probably because Zimri had burned down the palace in the previous one. And so he decided to start fresh. And so he bought a hill and he built a brand new city, fortified it, and that became his capital, Samaria. Now, time went by, and the Samaritans that you hear of, like the Good Samaritan, and the Samaritans that were kind of the antagonist, I guess they weren't really the antagonist, the protagonist maybe at the time of Jesus, the Samaritans that nobody liked, was somewhat of a different group of people, but they lived in that place that Omri built. Well, Ahab becomes king, and it turns out that he also was quite a builder, built a magnificent palace. Some translations of the Bible say it was an ivory palace. Others say that it was a palace adorned with ivory. But ivory's hard to get, right? You have to chase down an elephant and get the tusks and so on. It's indicates substantial wealth. So Ahab builds a fabulous palace. He builds many cities in Israel. He's not idle. He has great aspirations. So Ahab becomes king, and it started long before Ahab, but he gets interested in the daughter of the king of Sidon, right? You've heard of Sidon, up on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And he marries her. Now, apparently she's quite the socialite and quite a personality. And as you've heard about her as the stories go by, you know that she figures large. But she's what we might call a celebrity, I suppose, today. And so he figures that will be good for him, and he marries her. But it turns out that her family worships Baal. And they are all in with Baal. And so he decides he should please his wife. And he builds a temple to Baal in Samaria. And he builds an altar there. And he sets up the worship of Baal. That was his choice. Baal was thought by the folks of that time to be the god of the rain. Baal's the one who brought rain to make the crops grow. At least, so they thought. So the story goes on from there, and you know the story. If you read in the writings in the New Testament in the book of James, it tells us that Elijah prayed. He could see what was happening, that Ahab, the reverence for God might have been waning. Ahab wholesale threw it over and introduced, as the leader of the nation, started worshiping Baal and getting people to worship Baal. And that might seem kind of absurd. But maybe it isn't. Think about it this way. It might be almost like the time we live in now. Because we believe that God brings the rain, or doesn't, as the case may be. God provides, it makes the seeds grow. But in this day and age, it's thought that, that's not really scientific, right? The popular view that most people hold is, that stuff all just happens, it just evolved. And so if you're to be respected out there in kind of the scientific world, that's your belief. So while we might consider Ahab and say, Ahab, he's kind of a silly guy. I mean, after all, he brought this other god that everybody worships and thinks brings the rain. I'm not sure we're much different in this day and age because people think it just happened all by itself, which is more silly, that a stone idol brings the rain or it just happens all by itself. It might be similar. And if you believe in God, you're considered a little bit peculiar, to use the word that Peter uses, right? We're a peculiar people. That's the time Ahab lived in. So Elijah could see that things were really, all the people were turning their back on God and believing in this much more popular, a lot less problematic guy, Baal. And they had fancy services, I'm certain. And it felt like it was really, the in thing. So Elijah prays. And God says, like a lot of times when you pray for something, God says, that's a good idea, why don't you go? So Elijah prays, and God says, go down there and tell Ahab that it won't rain until I say it will. So Elijah does. He goes down and tells Ahab. If you want to follow along, it says in 1 Kings 16, 17, 18. 17 is the story about the rain, or the lack of a rain. Why did God decide it wouldn't rain? Well, because they were worshiping an idol who they thought would make it rain. So God decided to do this, not just for the sake of it, but to directly confront what Ahab was doing. And it didn't rain. And it actually got pretty dire. If you look over in the latter part of Well, the latter part of chapter 17 is the story of Elijah. He goes and stays with a widow in Zarephath and asks the widow to give him a drink and some food first, as you kind of heard this morning. And I've still got my drink right here. But as time goes along, after 3.5 years, it's gotten pretty dry in Israel. In fact, it's gotten so dry that there's not even enough grass to keep Ahab's horses alive. So Ahab is off looking for grass, and he gets his servant Obadiah to help him, and Elijah comes back. And you know how the story goes. Elijah says to Ahab, listen, here's one of the favorite lines. Elijah comes to meet Ahab, and when he gets in front of Ahab, let's see. Ahab greets Elijah in kind of the similar fashion, the way he seems to always greet Elijah. He says, is that you, you troubler of Israel? I can remember way back, when I heard that story as a child. It was a girl who lived next door there, we used to play with and so forth. And if I got kind of frustrated with her, I would call her a troubler of Israel, because in my experience at about 4 or 5 years old, that was about the worst thing that you could really set somebody back, was to call them a troubler of Israel. You'll notice, verse 16 of chapter 18, when Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, is that you, you troubler of Israel? And Elijah says, I haven't made any trouble for Israel, you did. And so on, and you know how it goes. They go up on Mount Carmel, and they have quite a ceremony there. And at the end of the day, fire comes from heaven and burns up Elijah's offering and his altar and licks up the water in the ditch even. And Elijah says to the people, seize the prophets of Baal, and all 450 of them are slaughtered. And meanwhile, Ahab stands by. And I just want you to remember that. Meanwhile, Ahab stands by. Well, then it rains, right? Ahab sends his servant up, and they see that little cloud the size of a man's hand. And so Elijah says to Ahab, well, listen, you better go back home, because it's going to really rain. And the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Elijah, and he runs in front of Ahab's chariot all the way down Mount Carmel, which is up in northwestern Israel, not too far from the coast of the Mediterranean, runs all the way back down to Jezreel. Well, Ahab gets home, and he sees Jezebel. Now, somehow Jezebel stayed home. Who knows? Maybe she kind of had an inkling what was going to happen. But she stayed home, and when Ahab gets back home, he says, you wouldn't believe what happened. You can imagine Jezebel wasn't too happy. Probably it was an unpleasant evening for Ahab. And she threatens Elijah, and Elijah runs away. That's not really our focus. Let's keep up with what happens with Ahab. Elijah has an experience on Mount Sinai, if you will. You'll have to study that out if you doubt it. But Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And Elijah has an experience down there with God. Some time goes by, and the king of Aram is a country to the east, and he mustered his army, and he gets 32 other kings to help him. Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, and they all unite, and they go up and besiege Samaria, Ahab's capital, with Ahab inside. And Ben-Hadad sends some messengers to Ahab and says, Ahab, all your gold, all your silver, all your best wives, all your best children, they're mine. And Ahab replies, says, just as you say, my lord. All I have and I and even me are yours. He realizes he's beat. The next day, the messengers come back and says, this is what Ben-Hadad says. Yesterday I demanded your silver and gold, your wives and your children. But tomorrow I'm going to send my officials to search your palace and the houses of your officials and all of your offices, if you will, and they're going to take everything of value. Well, the king summoned the elders together and said, "This is too much. I was willing to give him my gold and silver, my wives and my children, but this is too much." And the elders advised him, "Don't listen to his demands. Tell him no." So he told him no. He said, "Listen, I would do what said I would do yesterday, but this is too much. Forget it." So Ben-Hadad says, "Well, that's the end of the line for you." Meanwhile, a prophet came to Ahab. Here in chapter 20. Prophet came to Ahab and said, "This is what the Lord says. Do you see this vast army? I will give it into your hand today, and then you will know that I am the Lord." Verse 13 of chapter 20. "Well," says Ahab, "who will do this?" The prophet said, "This is what God says. The junior officers of the provincial commanders will do it." "Okay," he says, "well, who will start the battle?" The prophet says, "You will." So Ahab summoned the 232 officers of the provincial commanders and the rest of the Israelites, 7,000 in all. Not a very big army. And they set out at noon. Well, Ben-Hadad and the 32 kings that were with him were in their tents drinking. The junior officers of the provincial commanders went out first. Now, Ben-Hadad had sent out some scouts, and they came and told him, "Men are advancing from Samaria." "Well," says Ben-Hadad, "if they've come out for peace, take them alive. And if they've come out for war, take them alive." And the junior officers marched out, and they met the Ben-Hadad's soldiers that he'd sent, and they struck down their opponents, and the whole army was terrified. And it says in verse 21, "The king of Israel advanced, overpowered the horses and the chariots, and inflicted heavy losses on the Arameans." For a moment, Ahab did what God told him to do, didn't he? Followed his instructions carefully. And when it was all over, the prophet came to the king and said, "Strengthen your positions and do what you need to do, because next spring he'll be back." Now, meanwhile, Ben-Hadad's advisors told him a whole bunch of stuff about, well, the problem is that he attacked in the mountains. He needs to attack in the plains because apparently the gods of the mountains favor the Israelites, and maybe the gods of the plains would favor Ben-Hadad and so forth. And he says, "Oh, yeah, good idea." In any event, the next spring, Ben-Hadad mustered his army and came out again, just as the prophet had said. Meanwhile, Ahab had done what God told him to do. He'd been getting ready. The prophet comes to Ahab as the army's coming and says, "I'll deliver this army into your hands, and you will know that I am the Lord," down in verse 28, just like he said last year. "For 7 days they camped opposite each other. On the 7th day the battle was joined, and the Israelites inflicted 100,000 casualties on the Aramean foot soldiers in one day." That seems impossible to even fathom. God was behind it for sure. The rest of them escaped. Ben-Hadad fled to the city and hid in an inner room. And his officials said, "Listen, Ben-Hadad, things aren't looking good, but the kings of Israel are merciful. They're kind of gentle guys, so let's go ask him if you can live." "Good idea," Ben-Hadad says, because he knew his game was over. So they go and see Ahab, and they said, Ben-Hadad asked, "Please let me live." And Ahab answers, "Oh, is he still alive? He's my brother." Well, the men took that as a good sign, Ben-Hadad's men, and were quick to capitalize on that, as we would say, and say, "Oh, yes, your brother Ben-Hadad," they said. "Well, go and get him," Ahab asked. And when he came out, Ahab asked him up into his chariot. And Ben-Hadad right away proposed some favorable terms. He said, "Listen, I'll return all those cities that my father took from your father. And not only that, you can set up a market in Damascus, in my capital." those were both actually very significant concessions on Ben-Hadad's part, but he's thinking that this might keep him alive. So, desperate times call for desperate measures. And Ahab says, well, that's a great idea. I'll set you free. But then a prophet, one of the company of the prophets, came up with a whole disguise thing, and we got to go all the way to the end of chapter 20. And the prophet confronted Ahab and said, this is what the Lord said, down in verse 42 of chapter 20, you have set free a man that I had determined should die. Therefore, it's your life for his, your people for his people. Sullen and angry, the king of Israel went back to his palace in Samaria. He didn't, sullen and angry, just remember that part. Well, a little time went by, and Ahab decided that Naboth's vineyard would make an excellent garden, because after all, it was right near his palace. And apparently, probably Naboth had done a good job with it, and it was very fertile. And Ahab thought, well, if the grapevines are growing fantastic there, my vegetables will grow fantastic there too. So he says, Naboth, sell me your vineyard. Or if you want, I'll get you another one that's even better. And Naboth said, no, it's been in my family for years. It was my inheritance from God. I think I should keep it. Verse 4, so Ahab went home sullen and angry. And he lay on his bed, sulking, and refused to eat. So after a while, Jezebel came along. And you know what happened? Well, why are you so down, Ahab? Well, because Ahab won't sell me his vineyard. Oh, says Jezebel, that's no trouble. And Jezebel being Jezebel, she arranged to have Naboth murdered. And when it was all over, she went and said, hey, Ahab, took care of your problem. Ahab is dead. Oh, said Ahab, and he jumped up and went to get the vineyard. His conscience didn't bother him a whole lot, clearly. And then we come to what David read to us here. Elijah shows up again and confronts Ahab and says, boy, you murdered somebody and to take their vineyard. And you've done evil. And Ahab repents. Or at least he doesn't like the sentence that's pronounced on him. One way or the other. And he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and fasted, and he lay in sackcloth and went around meekly, it says. And God relents on the sentence for the time being. Well, 3 years go by. And now Jehoshaphat is king of Judah. And Jehoshaphat goes down to visit Ahab. Now, Ahab is a little unhappy because, let's see, the city of Ramoth Gilead has been, somewhere along the way, has been captured by the king of Aram. And I don't know, Ben-Hadad says he's going to give back the cities, but I guess he didn't give this one back, or it wasn't included, or it's been taken later. But in any event, king of Aram has taken Ramoth Gilead, and that bothers Ahab. So as Jehoshaphat is there, you know what happens. He says, listen, hey, this guy took this city from me, and we're not doing anything. Let's go get it back. Will you help me, Jehoshaphat? And Jehoshaphat, he was a godly man, but whenever you read this story, it just seems like he's a little bit silly. Even the first graders would have figured out what was going on here. And he says, well, let's seek counsel of the Lord. That's a good idea. So the king got together a whole bunch of prophets. Then Jehoshaphat says, well, don't you have any prophet that serves God here? Well, says Ahab, yes, there is one, but he never prophesies anything good about me. So I don't like him. Well, the king shouldn't say such a thing, Jehoshaphat replied. All right, so they bring in Micaiah. And you know how it goes. There's a whole dramatic back and forth. But ultimately, you have to go all the way down the end since we want to kind of get through our story here. Ultimately, Micaiah says to him, you know, I saw Israel like sheep without a shepherd. I'm sure you've heard that before. I saw Israel like sheep without a shepherd, everybody milling around, and they all went home, which is to say the king was dead. And Ahab says to Jehoshaphat, you know, see, I told you, he never prophesies anything good for me. All right, well, fair enough, he didn't prophesy anything good. But what does Ahab do? He tries a little strategy. He decides he's going to outsmart God. He says, well, all right. Micaiah says that if we go out to this battle, they're going to be looking for me. So he says, hey, Jehoshaphat, I have an idea. I've got a plan for you. We're going to go to the battle. Thank you for helping me. You know, wear your regular kingly attire, but listen, this time I'm going to go in disguise, so I'm going to be kind of clandestine. Special forces. This is what I say. What's with Jehoshaphat? Couldn't he see it coming? But in any event, he didn't, I guess, and so he goes along with the plan. But Ahab's trying to outsmart God, right? He figures, well, yeah, they're going to be looking for the king. That's what Micaiah says. But Jehoshaphat won't know any better. Let's send him out there. They'll find him. And sure enough, they do. They chase him until Jehoshaphat cries out to God for help, and they let Jehoshaphat go. They realize he's not Ahab. And Ahab's plan didn't work too well because, you know, in the artillery section, in those days the artillery, I guess, was the people firing arrows. In the artillery sections, they're firing the arrows and somebody fires an arrow, and it says at random, but I don't think it was entirely at random. The arrow whizzes over, and it happens to strike Ahab just at the joints in his armor. All right, it's not entirely at random. And it mortally wounds Ahab, and by the end of the day, he's dead. Jehoshaphat goes back to Jerusalem. Well, there's a summary of the story, you know, all the things we've learned about Ahab. And you think, oh dear. Here's a few things, I think there's 5 things we can take away from this story that will be instructive for us. Just occurred to me to maybe change my order, but I guess I won't change my order. First of all, and maybe this is the part that got me interested in the story, there's good news. God doesn't give up on us. Even when you do wildly evil things like Ahab, God doesn't give up. He doesn't go away shocked and say, you're hopeless. He keeps on. I mean, look how he kept after Ahab. Ahab decides to go off and he, wholesale sets up the worship of Baal after he marries Jezebel. So what does God do? He sets up the whole episode with the drought and the experience on Mount Carmel, and at the end of the day, Ahab sees fire come down from heaven and burn up rocks and water. But that doesn't quite impress Ahab, apparently. So, not long after that, the Syrian army, the Aramean army shows up with Ben-Hadad, and twice God sends a prophet and says to Ahab, Ahab, I'm going to give you the victory. And he tells him why he's going to do it. So that you will know I am the Lord. I guess the experience on Mount Carmel wasn't enough. So 2 years in a row, Ahab is given a stunning victory over a superior Aramean force so that he'll know that God is the Lord. God doesn't give up. Well, time goes by and Ahab, I guess, isn't so interested in what God's doing. He's interested in improving the quality of his culinary affairs. And he takes Naboth's vineyard. And God confronts him through Elijah, just like he confronted him. But when God confronts, that's good news. That means that God hasn't given up on him. When God gives up, like with Jeroboam and Baasha here, they're wiped right out. But God hasn't given up. God confronts Ahab about the worship of Baal, and we have the episode on Mount Carmel. God gives him 2 victories. God confronts him over his, and he actually didn't have Naboth murdered, but Jezebel did. But Ahab's responsible for that because, well, he's the king. Now you'll notice something about Ahab here in a minute, but he's the king, and so he's responsible. God confronts him, and Ahab responds. He goes around in sackcloth and ashes. But apparently that's short-lived, I guess, because a few years later, Ahab's thinking that he's really bothered by the fact that, his city of Ramoth-Gilead, or Ramoth in Gilead, I guess is probably the right way to think of it, is still held by the Arameans, and so he goes up there, and when God tells him, you go up there and you're going to die. God's still trying. But Ahab decides not to listen and goes anyway. He thinks he can outsmart God. And he tries this whole thing with Jehoshaphat. And it doesn't work out, and that's the end of Ahab. But here's the thing. God never gives up, no matter how far we wander. And that's good news. God keeps on. That's why I say I think there's more in common between me and Ahab than maybe at first I'd like to admit. Let's think for a little bit about Ahab. What's Ahab like? What's he like as a person? Well, he's actually quite capable. You might first disagree with that. But no, he is. At the end of the story, it says, he built a palace, he built the city, he built the army, he built other cities. I don't know how many, it doesn't say. He built other cities. He doesn't just sit around. When he was told to prepare, because the Arameans are coming back, he did, successfully, and he was ready to meet them. When Ahab says, listen, gather everybody on Mount Carmel, Ahab does. He's actually can be quite capable. But he's also a bit of a schemer, as we've seen. The favorite one is, his scheme with Jehoshaphat, but all along the way, he's trying some maneuver. He's also self-absorbed. Notice twice we read where he was sullen and angry when he didn't get what he wanted. For no other reason than he just didn't get what he wanted. Or if someone comes along like the prophet there did after, to confront him, then he's sullen and angry because he was confronted. He couldn't do what he wanted. There's also good news about God in this story, that no matter how wicked we've been, when we repent, God responds. Because God actually comes to Elijah and said, hey, Elijah, have you noticed Ahab? How he's humbled himself? Now, we can debate whether he was truly humbled or whether he was trying another scheme. I don't know, but no less an authority than God himself says he's humbled himself. There's great power in humbling oneself before God God changes his mind. There's always time to repent. That's the second bit of good news about God in this story. Here's the fourth thing to learn from this story. We're free to choose, and our choices make all the difference in the world. Look at the choices. Look at the choices that Ahab made throughout the story, at least as we have it written down. The first thing he did is he chose a wife that probably wasn't such a smart choice, looking back. Maybe not even looking forward. Probably he didn't care. But he chose a wife for the wrong reasons. She was something of a celebrity. Then he chose to have the people worship Baal. A follow-on choice. God confronts him. Ahab sees fire come down from heaven. But he doesn't choose. He doesn't change his mind. He continues on his path. He might have changed his mind. I'm sure he was impressed that day. As he was riding back home that evening as it's raining, it would be hard to ignore God. We've just seen fire, he'd just seen fire come down from heaven, and at Elijah's prayer, it's now pouring rain. And Elijah's running as fast as the horses in front of the chariot. It would be hard to ignore the fact that God is real and working. But time goes by, and Ahab doesn't choose, he doesn't make a determination to change his direction. He just thinks, wow, that was something, and appears to go on about his business. God gives him the victory over the Syrians 2 times. And it doesn't change his mind. He had the power of choice, and each time he chose to do what seemed good to him, not what God wanted. And you can see at the end of the story with the Syrians, Ahab is a little bit self-important. Ben-Hadad says, hey, Ahab, how about I get to stay alive? Now, why in the world would Ahab say, oh, sure. Why not? I mean, you've only attacked us twice. But if you think about it, if you put yourselves in Ahab's shoes, he's feeling pretty self-important at that point, right? He's just inflicted 100,000 casualties. He's enjoying the position of power that he has right then. And he's feeling really magnanimous right then. He thinks he can afford to be powerful. He thinks he can afford to let Ben-Hadad go because he's powerful. But is he powerful? He seems to have forgotten that the reason he has the 2 victories is because God gave him the victories so that he would know that God is the Lord. God's in charge. But I wonder if that same problem has afflicted me. That when things go well, I think, well, isn't that wonderful? I'm in great shape. And forget that God's the one who put me there. I think it would be easy to fall into Ahab's mistakes. And then, of course, the last choice that we see that Ahab makes is, in spite of a clear, nobody doubted. I don't think Ahab doubted for a minute that Micaiah was speaking the words from God, but Ahab still thought he could just do what he wanted anyway. He wasn't ready to acknowledge that God is supreme. That's another thing about God we learn in this story, that no matter what kind of crazy stuff we do, God continues on with his plan anyway. We're not going to upset him. We can choose to ignore him, but God continues on. He's not flustered. And he continued on with the nation of Israel. But in this final choice, Ahab decides, well, okay, God, you've told me that if I go up there, it's not going to end well, and I will be killed. But I'm going to go anyway because I think I've got a plan. I think I've got a scheme that's going to save me, God. I'm going to show you that I can do it. I can do it myself. And it doesn't work. They have to wheel Ahab home dead. But we can say how evil he is and how revolting, but I would say I've fallen into that same mistake of thinking, I think I can do this. Notice how the choices build up over time. They accumulate. His first mistake, he chooses a wicked woman as his wife. And then he chooses to have everybody worship her God. And then when he's confronted, he doesn't really change. Because, well, he'd have to confront his wife, and that would be really awful. She seems pretty fierce. And the choices kind of snowball. Each time it gets harder and harder for him to change his mind, till at the end, he thinks that God can be trifled with. Remember, this is the God, who rained fire from heaven, rained rain from heaven, and defeated a massive army, but he still thinks he can trifle with this God. I need to be sure I don't make the same mistake and somehow think I can trifle with God. God is large, God is big, and God is in charge. Choices matter. The difference here for Ahab is he never chose. Do you notice he never really, while he might have been accomplished in getting things done, he never would take a stand when it was unpopular. Elijah says, hey, we're going to murder the 450 prophets of Baal your wife has set up here. Ahab says, oh, okay. He's the commander of the army. But right then it wouldn't be popular to oppose Elijah, because Elijah just called fire down from heaven and everybody was laying flat on the ground saying, the Lord, he is God. And so Ahab realized that if he opposed murdering the prophets of Baal, it wasn't going to go well. The entire nation was against him. They'd taken note of the fire. He wasn't going to make an unpopular choice. He continues on that way, right? He makes the smooth choice to let Ben-Hadad live. When Naboth tells him, no, you can't have my vineyard, what does Ahab do? He goes home and lays on his bed and doesn't eat. That's not the hallmark of someone who will take a stand for what they believe. Jezebel actually tells him, what's the matter with you? You're the king. She has a point. Ahab never chooses what is right and sticks with it. Maybe there's the lesson for me. That all that matters is choosing what is right and sticking with it. God will continue to woo. God will continue to pursue me. The key is, will I choose to follow him? The key is, will I choose? Or will I, like Ahab, just kind of go along, doing what seems good? The whole story is set up fabulous because we find two men in the story throughout. We have Elijah and Ahab throughout the whole story. Notice how they contrast. Elijah follows God's instructions without fail. Ahab resists God's instructions throughout. Except when it was, Ahab was going to win a big victory. Then he kind of thought it might be a good idea to go along. Both men were tempted to doubt God. Even Elijah was tempted, right? He ran away. He ran I don't know how many hundreds of miles, but a long ways, because Mount Carmel is in the very northern part of Israel, just before you head off to Tyre. And Mount Sinai, or the mountain of God, Mount Horeb, is way down south of Israel. So it's a long ways. Elijah ran away, and when God finds him and says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Well, you don't understand. This guy's crazy. They've killed everybody that served you, God, and I'm the only one left, and I'm tuckered out. I've had enough." God says, "Oh, no worries. There's more than you, and I've got a plan." Elijah ran away. Ahab ran away. God pursued both of them. God pursued Elijah down there to the cave. God pursued Ahab. What's different between the two fellows? Well, Elijah was pursuing God's goals. Remember, he's the one that prayed that it wouldn't rain to turn the hearts of the people back to God. Elijah is about God's purposes and all about God's cause. Ahab, on the other hand, he's pursuing his own ideas, his own whims, kind of what seems like it might be a fun idea to him right now. And we listed some of the things he'd done, right? We look at what he pursued. We'll go back to Elijah in a minute. Elijah pursued Jezebel and his neighbor's vineyard and building an ivory palace and taking back a city that he'd lost. And building cities, fortified cities, it says, around his kingdom. That's what Ahab was interested in. Elijah, on the other hand, is interested in doing God's work. The difference is simply the choice. Will I do God's work or do what I want? Do what I feel like? Notice also that in doing God's work, it wasn't always pleasant for Elijah, but God provided what Elijah needed all the time. Whether it was while he was hiding at the brook or up with the widow making the cakes, or whether it was God's protection, whether it was a nice hot meal as Elijah was running away, God was always there providing. Interestingly, notice that God also provided for Ahab. But God provided what Ahab needed, not necessarily what Ahab wanted. God provided defeat of the enemy when they came to attack. God provided whatever Ahab needed, but not necessarily what he wanted. So here's the key lesson to take away from Ahab. It all comes down to a matter of choice. It all comes down to my choice. Will I reach out and take hold of what God has provided? Will I humble myself and choose to do God's work God's way? Seek to advance God's purposes? Or will I choose to try to find some way to do it my way, like Ahab did? You can see how it turns out for Ahab, and you can see how it turns out for Elijah, right? When the story ends, Elijah's buried in a tomb in Samaria. Ahab's buried in a tomb in Samaria, and Elijah rides in a chariot to heaven. The way the story ends gives me an incentive to choose wisely in spite of all of the enticement and the popular kind of impetus to go another way. I hope we'll all choose Elijah's way rather than Ahab's way. Our closing hymn, I think 569, is it not?